Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on April 16th. We had a little bit of a scheduling conflict with Jeremy Minty, so that one will have to be postponed. But yeah, we're figuring it out and we'll make sure you guys know what the next webinar will be in our email. But yeah, if you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner on Find Your Ancestors with Maps and Timelines. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James Tanner has spent over 18 years as a family history volunteer and is presently serving at the BYU Library Family History Center. He is on the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And we'll now turn the time over to James.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here for another BYU Library Family History Center webinar. Today, we're going to talk about finding your ancestors with maps and timelines. And maybe you had never thought of the process that you would go through to use maps and timelines as a basis for discovering your ancestors. So we'll go through that process because it becomes something that's an integral part of learning. And in order to understand this, there's a few things that we need to cover. And that is genealogical research begins and ends with the locations of events in our ancestors' lives. Location is the most important of all of the issues that we deal with. Sometimes we kind of end up fixating on the names of our ancestors. Sometimes there's other factors. But when we're searching for records about our ancestors and doing what we would call genealogical research, then it's the location that's important. That means the location of event in your ancestor's life. So we know something in it. You think of it in a sense of your ancestors are sort of floating out there. And when you find the location and you accurately use that, you can then fix them down. So then they're not a moving target. They're not as difficult as they were before. It may turn out to be more difficult because it may turn out they were born someplace that you weren't expecting, or that you don't, the language is different. But from the standpoint of the focus of your research, it should always be on the location of the events. And this is something that you would quite usually run into, and that is the definition of all this. Valuable genealogical documents and records are created at or near the time an event occurred in your ancestors' lives and were recorded by someone who witnessed the event or had a duty to report the event. Now, what does that mean, and why does it mean that much to a genealogist? So let me give you an example. Let's call it a birth record, and that's, even though birth records are quite recent innovations in the world. If we had a birth record, it would be reliable if it was recorded at or near the time the child was born. But it may not be, for instance, in this case, the mother who delivered the child perhaps was not making that record. And so it had to be someone who witnessed the birth or someone who had a duty to report the birth. So all of those factors come into being. Now, the question, of course, is how reliable is the record? And by going through this process, you can begin to understand why you would be asking the question about the reliability of the records. So the key here is that since it was recorded by someone who was at or near or had a duty, that the location of the event is now where the documents can be found. That doesn't mean that the physical document is going to be somewhere near where the mother had the child or where the baby was born, but it will mean that the record that's created is going to be created and kept and maintained and cataloged based on that location. So where the baby was born was where the record was recorded in that area. Now, records move, they go around, they get put places else. But when they do, generally speaking, when we're talking about genealogical records, these records are always, let's say, nearly always organized in some geographic fashion. If you go into a library and they're using their card catalog system or their catalog system, you're going to find the genealogical records organized on the shelves by the geographical location of the origin of the record. So English records are going to be in the English section. Uh, German records are going to be in a German section, and so by that catalog. Cataloging is not an exact science. It's more of a uh, sort of a way of looking at information. And catalogs aren't always consistent, aren't always completely done. But in any case, your only way you're going to begin to find the records is by knowing the location of at least one event, or more preferably, in your ancestor's life. Now, we're, why were we why are we talking about maps and timelines? Maps and timelines are work together. They're almost inseparable. You have to know the time factor of the location, whether the record occurred, for example, if the baby that's being born was born in 1850, that makes a great difference if they were born in 1950. And it would be even more different if they were born in 2025, the current year. So where the records might be kept depends on the time depth of the records. So when the records were first created, they may have been maintained very locally. For example, if they were church records in the Catholic Church, they would have been maintained in the Catholic parish, which was maintained by the priest, and the priest was uh, in contact with and in a small area with a certain number of members of the church. And so when those records were created, it was simple because they were there in the church. The people who, if they needed to look at the record for any reason, could go to the priest and look at the records, and that's where they were maintained. But in the Catholic analogy here, the Catholic record, the parish register for, in many instances, and almost universally in the Catholic Church, were copied into the diocese, which could be in a very different location than than the original church. So knowing that the structure of the record of how the records are being kept, and adding to that the time frame and the uh, the history and the kind of the geography of the region are all facts, all things that assist us in identifying an individual. This is especially true when we get into the situation of same person, same name, like this one. Maps and timelines, they're tools for avoiding that. Um, it's not impossible that a person could be born in a very small community, for example, in the same parish, and have the same name and have the same parents' names. If you've done uh, any kind of work in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark in the Scandinavian countries, you'll find that that's not only possible, it's very common that you may have all the names in the families, this, even if not identical, very, very similar. And so when you start looking there in those situations, then location becomes even more important. And as that importance is, and you fix on, and as you focus in on the location where the events occurred, then you start to separate people that have the same names. So this is kind of the process that we're talking about and why we would have a constant use for both timelines and um, the records that are being kept. Now, a timeline can be simple. It could just be like this one. This is a family search timeline, and it reflects the records that have been used and the information that's been put into the family search individual for this one. In this case, Eliza Ellen Parkinson. And the events that occurred. Now, why would the timeline be important? Well, let's say, for example, that you find a record that has the wrong date, that somehow or another the date was incorrectly recorded. When you put it in your timeline, it may be obvious that there's a problem. But otherwise, there may not be, and that could be very well let's call it a stumbling block to looking ahead with that particular person's research. So this one is FamilySearch.org Family Tree. As you enter your people's names into your ancestors, your relatives' names into the Family Search Family Tree, these timelines are automatically generated. At the same time, there's a map here that could be either a regular drawn map or a satellite view. And all of the events are grouped on geographically, so you can see very quickly. And unfortunately, can't zoom in on this, but on the program, you can zoom in and see where each of those uh, places were registered on the map. Now that came from what's entered into the personal page, the profile page for each of the individuals. If you don't put in the correct information, if you don't put in the correct dates, and you don't put in the correct places, or you put in something like Mexico or United States instead of the place where the events occurred being specific, then the timeline doesn't work and the map doesn't work because it's not really going to give you a very good idea of what happened in the sequence of the events that happened. Now, for example, in this map, if we found a dot clear over in the eastern part of the United States, and we go back to the timeline to see where that dot came from, also by clicking on it, you could get in there and look at it. You may find out that date had been either incorrectly recorded or did not pertain to this person. So the maps and the timelines are what give you the overview kind of way of making the distinctions and coming to correct conclusions. Just a reminder, this is automatically generated. This is nothing you have to do to create this, on either the map or the timeline, other than putting the information into each of the individuals in your portion of the Family Search Family Tree. So another part that's important is because you're going to get the sequence of the documents. So as you add sources and as they and now in Family Search Family Tree, for example, and in many of the other programs, you enter the date of the source so that when the source is used by the program, then it would be you would be able to see the continuity of the sources. And this is an example of a timeline of the profile timeline for um, someone in the MyHeritage program. Now, MyHeritage has a more sophisticated, more detailed timeline but this one is the source timeline, meaning this one was generated by the sources themselves. And so there's a document that corresponds to each of the dates that are entered here on the timeline. So this is an example of a different way, slightly different way of handling the timeline. And as I mentioned, that when we go back through this and look at it, there's things that are going to be obvious. If you see a birth date and it's already been preceded by the death date of one of the parents, then you know there's a problem. If the parents were dead, there's probably not going to be a relationship between the birth child. Now, this is the the timeline from MyHeritage. And I'm giving this as an example because because using all of these programs, the large programs, is something that uh, depending on partially depending on where your ancestors came from, may be the key for you to for making advancements in doing your genealogy. Um, Having one of the programs is really kind of looking at one set of documents. And a lot of people say, well, they got all the same stuff. No, they don't. They all have unique documents that are valuable for doing your research. And they have and each of the large websites have a focus, and that focus makes them more important for use than they would be if you just ignored them. For example, uh, my Family Search has been in gathering records since the 1800s, and now their record sets is very large and it's very diverse all over the world. But Family Search has a tremendous number of records from Latin America. And that's an important reason for using Family Search if you have Latin American ancestors. Also has a huge number of records for English-speaking countries like the United States and UK and Canada and Australia, New Zealand. And it has a lot of diverse other records that are quite surprising and is growing all the time. Ancestry, as in kind of the focus on originally on ancestry, started out with records that you would think of as English-speaking countries. So those were the records that were gathered most frequently. Ancestry, and as over the years, has branched out into getting records in Scandinavia and in Germany and in many other places. But as you look for records, you can compare the way the records are kept by these different websites by going to their catalog and doing searches for places. Look for places. See how many of the records they have for the place that you're interested in doing the research. Okay, so that's the way you make this distinction. MyHeritage is European based and has, in the sense, it's the MyHeritage is actually the headquarters is actually in outside of Tel Aviv, Israel, but the emphasis of their website all along has been on Central and Eastern Europe, and so their collections uh, are more valuable if your people came from that part of Europe. And now they're collecting records from all around the world, and they may have the only unique set of records that there are. Um, they have been gathering Greek records. Family Search has some Greek records, and now MyHeritage is starting to acquire Greek records. That's just an example. So back to the timeline. In this timeline, it gives a lot of information about each of the family members. It shows the ages of the ancestors at various points in their lives because there's the time frame across the top. You can see quickly about when they lived. You can also see when the age of the parent was when the child was born. So you follow the little lines and they tell you a lot more about the thing. They also show their relative lifespans and where they overlapped with other family members or with major world events. So in this case, the timeline can also be adjusted to show from 3 to 9 generations. So if you want a lot of information, and you have a lot of information in your family tree, then you can see this in all over. You can do a lot of discovering here. Um, in this case, it's when we look at the dates, we can quickly determine another factor, and that's the accuracy. So if Frances Tanner here is shown on this date had been born when the mother was, say, 60 years old or 70 years old, and that was what was shown on the information in the family tree, then it would be graphically shown here that Frances Tanner was not was born at that point, and you just look at it and say, that's a mistake or that's a problem. So this is one way to getting some information out of all of what's happening. Now, the cross-hatched areas are the major events, and they're being added in, and there's always development going on with all of these larger websites. And so you're going to see this development happening with Family Search and Ancestry and MyHeritage and Find My Past, everything out there. But in this case, what we are seeing is that you can look down here quickly and see which of your ancestors would have been available for service in World War I, World War II, and some of the other events that are portrayed on the timeline. So you can see from the relative size that Harold Morgan, because he was 33 years old when a child was born, and that was the before 1939 and the kind of official or beginning of the World War II, he was probably not someone who fought in the war because he would not have been available, as you will, as a draftee to get into the army. It's possible if it got bad enough, like they did with World War II, they could have had a second draft and a second. Everybody had to register, so there's a first registration and second registration for draft registration for World War II. But this will give you some idea of whether or not to look for that kind of record from your ancestor. So these vertical bars show your important events, and you see that by hovering over it with your cursor on your mouse from your control device. So here's kind of what it looks like. Now I'm down there at the bottom, and I was born when my father was 20 years old, and he was born when his father was 29 years old. And my my mother's not on here, but my grandmother was already deceased when I was very long before I was born. In addition, my great grandfather died before I was born. I mean, my grandfather died before I was born. So Leroy P. Tanner, which is Leroy Parkinson Tanner, and Eva Margaret Overson, both were deceased before I was born. And this shows that graphically. Just following the lines down, you can see that my particular segment is not over the same timelines as either Leroy or Eva. But you can see another one is that I did know and I was aware of and had in my life my great grandfather. excuse me, my great-grandmother, who did live time over my time. Now, why would we look at this? Well, because as we go back in time and as we're looking at the timeline, we can we can start to see some generalizations. We can say all these people, if you drew a line down through all of these people from the top to the bottom, except for my father, you would see that Henry and Leroy and Eliza, Ellen and Henry and Eva and Margaret were all alive at the same time. And is there a possibility that they knew each other? Well, they must have known each other well enough that their children married each other. And which of these people did my father know? Well, he knew his father for a while. His mother died when he was 8 years old, but he did know his grandparents, and that shows that he knew his grandparents, or could have known them if they were, if wherever the location was where they were as for where he was living. In fact, he was raised partially by his grandmother because his father was a contractor and worked on construction. Okay, so we move on, and the timeline shows that both my parents died young. When my father's parents died when he was quite young. They also show which people were contemporary with me very quickly. And so one other question, of course, we'd ask from genealogy, did I ever take advantage of that in getting genealogical information? Unfortunately, I did not, because not all these people died before I became aware of the need for genealogical information. But the good news was that all their lives are extremely well documented. And my one grandmother, Margaret Godfrey Jarvis, was a professional photographer and took over 4,500 images that I managed to inherit. So there's a lot of connection here, even though I did not know, other than Margaret, I did not know anyone else. And then you go up to the left-hand corner of the timeline on MyHeritage, and then you can see, you can put in another person. You can just change, and that changes the primary person. So we wanted to see Leroy's timeline. Uh, Obviously, we're not looking at the entire timeline here from the screenshot, but this is the kind of information that you're going to be able to see. And in each case, you can draw a line, vertical line down, or follow the vertical line down and see how many of these people were alive when they were together. Now, why is that an important something? Because they became in-laws in a sense as their children married. What about going to these other people if, for example, you needed to research William Ray, who was there, and you couldn't find very much information about William Ray, and you look up and you see that you can look at Damia Hopkins and Joanna Pond were both alive. Charles Parkinson was alive. James Parkinson was alive while he was alive. Maybe these other people had contact with these people. Maybe they lived in the same geographic area. Maybe the information that they have in their lives would help you find more information about others. So this is, in a sense, this also helps you do something which is called cluster research, where you're basically uh, examining people that were related to each other, or not related, but associated with each other in a specific geographic area. And that includes neighbors and relatives and friends and business associates and all of the kinds of things that are there. But here in this timeline, you have a graphic example of how that's functioning. So here's where you put in the person's name on, and this is all on MyHeritage. MyHeritage, by the way, is a subscription program. But if you go, you can get on and get a free copy of it. You can enter up to, I believe, around 250 names. Uh, you won't get the benefits of the program, but you'll get an idea of what it is and what kinds of things it can do, and make a choice as to whether you want to become involved with it. So once again, this is an example of seeing how many people were alive at the same time. If you draw this line down uh, close enough, you'll see that in this case, there were a considerable number of my grandparents who were and great grandparents who were alive at the same time. And that interesting is where they lived and how they lived. Um, so which ones could possibly have known the others? Obviously, the ones that got married, they knew the other relatives. But is it possible that some of these people knew the other people in the pedigree? And it gives you a clue as to how you came about, how what had to happen for you to be able to have become the descendants of all these people, and to see that they were all kind of out there in wherever they lived at the time, then you would have a pretty good guess as to how they became developed, how that developed, how you became who you are. Okay, jumping over to ancestry. Ancestry also has what's called the life story timeline for everyone in your ancestry family tree. So as you put people in your family tree, they will begin compiling this. If you look at it at the timelines and there's nothing there, it's because you don't have any documents or anything in the people with the people. So if you use the record hints or you do some research and you start adding people into your family tree on families on ancestry, you'll see this becoming populated with all of the information, including the maps and relationships. So it's telling me that this Cecil Annie Fothergill Cook is my fifth cousin, three times removed. Well, that's pretty remote, but it's interesting enough to find that this is somebody that is has this kind of information. The more research you do, the more records that you have, the more information that the program has to work with, the more detailed your timelines will be. Now, you can also create your own timeline if you want to with a spreadsheet or something similar, um, in a lined paper if you're still in a paper world, which I don't recommend, obviously. But using the same concept here. Now, one of the early things that I did and that was very valuable to me as both a learning process and a production of information about my ancestors was to uh, focus on getting all of I built a spreadsheet showing all of the censuses like shown here, and then showing all and listing all of the people in families, and then looking up and making sure I had the census record for every person for every year that they were alive and could have been in that census record. So it gave me also the overlap in a sense that I could begin to see that there were people how the people were related, why uh, my grandfather uh, Roy Tanner married an Overson, uh, and how all that occurred becomes clear as you watch the timelines here and how these people lived and where they lived and how the possibilities were that they could that the families could nuclear families could have been generated. That's kind of a official way not to say that they got married and had kids. Okay, so next step, and this is carrying it a little beyond the information that's in the timelines. This is how I use a map every single time I get someone a specific person question from um, who are on the consultations that I do for the Family Search Library, or whether they're people, patrons who come into the BYU library, or whether they're people who contact me directly for some reason. This is my way of using the information, and it's all involved with the location of the events. Okay. So if someone came into me, in this case, if they came into me and they said, my family came from Puerto Rico and I need to do some research to find my family. And my next question is always, where in Puerto Rico did they come from? And if the person has been fortunate enough to know that information, then they would say, a place in Puerto Rico, in this case, Ponce. Well, there's two questions here that arise immediately, and that the question is, where in Ponce were they born? If we just knowing the size, okay, so what the first thing I will do, will be to um, look this, look it up using Google, to do a Google search for the place. And then once I have the place, like Ponce in Puerto Rico, then I would be able to use that information to go to the map and look for it. Now I'm looking at it, I see that Ponce is it's not a little town, but it's not a great spreading metropolitan area. It's not part of any other major metropolitan area. It has a lot of littler towns around it. There's some towns way up in the mountains in the north of Ponce, but this is starting to tell me some information about the place. Now, why is that important? Why would I do that? Because location is so important. I need to understand the location. I need to know, is it possible that records were kept in this place or were they kept someplace else? Now, if this was a tiny little town way up in the mountains, it's very unlikely that there was a parish church in that town. Could have been, but we don't know. But in the case of Ponce, it's not going to help me to know Ponce until I know the church where these people came from, in finding the Catholic churches, parish. So uh, this is the first step. The first step is at least know where this is in the world, so we know what we're talking about, and then we move on from there. Um, After I've been asked about this place, then we move on, and I have a map of the town. When I have this map, then I can see a little more uh, with zooming in, a little more of the area that I'm dealing with. But I want to see what this town looks like now. Why is that the case? Well, part of the problem of when we're doing genealogy and we get wrapped up in names and dates is we forget that this was real, that the people out there really lived and they had to be facing something. They grew up in a big town, in a little town, on a farm, or in the mountains, in the desert, where were they? And how did that affect where they were and what they could have possibly, what records we can find for that person. So the more I know about the place, the more likely I am to find records about that place. And the fact that there's things on here on this map that give me a lot more information about the place and who these people might be and where they might have come from,
and whether they were there originally or whether they were not, they came from Spain or some other part of Europe. But down in that corner down there, there's a big blue arrow, and the big blue arrow points at the peg man. Peg man is the little yellow guy that you can drag out to see the street view. So if you click on peg man and drag him out, you'll see all of those streets turn blue. And why does that mean? It means that Google has driven around with their cameras on every one of those streets and photographed the whole street back and forth and through the town. So all the blue marks when you move out Pegman are are streets where Google has been. Now, it may even be possible because in this case, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and we have census records, U.S. census records for Puerto Rico. And so we may be able to find down to the house and look at the house where the person lived. If we find our person that we're looking for in the census records, then we will have the address. We'll have the place where they lived. And using that, and maybe using other maps, the census enumeration maps, we should be able to find that place. And so if we pull out Pegman, then they all go blue, and then we can click on a place and, in a sense, drive around the entire town and see what it looks like. So here we are looking at a town that looks reasonably prosperous. They're nice homes, nicely kept streets, and that makes a huge difference as to whether or not we're going to find a lot of records, some records, or um, it will be more and more difficult. So we have here just a way of now we have a visual. In other words, we've come to the town, we can see what it looks like, and we have a visual way of understanding what we're dealing with. Now asking questions about them can become more specific, meaning that we can find more information. So one of the things you do with Google next is to put in the name of the place and then type the word churches, or you could type cemeteries, or you could type Burger King restaurants. Didn't matter, but it will then look for those. And so if I put in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and put churches, then I get a list of the churches in Ponce. And if you look down, the third one down, just going off the page here, it's the Parroquia Corazón de Jesús, and that's the parish church. So now we have at least one parish church. There may be many parish churches, but we can do that. So meanwhile, when you do that on the Maps program, Google Maps, then there are all the churches. Now I look at it and I see, well, there's a Parroquia El Buen Pastor, there's a Parroquia Santa Teresita, there's a Parroquia La Milagrosa, a Parroquia Cristo Rey. Looks like we're going to have to know a little more information before we do, or we're going to end up having to look in all these different parishes. There's two more at the bottom, one in the middle of the city. And so we have what this tells us immediately is there's a lot of population in here, and that when we're talking about somebody who says, well, they came from here, we're going to have to know more information and do more research to get more specific. Now, it would be doing the research in all these records, which would be a very, let's call it a significant effort, or simply finding out other records that might tell us, like a census record, where they lived, in which case we would be primarily looking for the closest parish church physically to them, because the parishes are divided up geographically. Now, all this information about knowing the Catholic Church and the way it operates and how the records were kept and where they might be kept and what time frame are the records kept and where would we go to look for the records, primarily in this case on Family Search. But the question then would be uh, that I guess the issue that I would say is that this is really the process that you have to go through to begin to understand what questions you need to ask and what you need to look for. And this comes about by starting and focusing on the area rather than looking up, spending time looking for names in countries like America, United States, where a lot of people have the same name, and more in Mexico, and more in Latin America in total. If I do a name that's a simple name, I could come up with 1 million records with that name. And I'm not going to go through all those records trying to find a person. This is the way we focus in to to actually have those records that we need. And we know what we need and we know what we need to go through. Now, what if we go through it and then we don't find the record? Then the simple thing, they might not have liked the priest, so they went to the next parish. So now you have more parishes that you might do. Which part of the town they came from wasn't that big a deal to go to the other. It may be in the parish for the wife. It may have been the parish for the husband. In Catholic marriages, I find that, and it's probably the case with marriages around the world, it's the wife that usually ends up having the place where the marriage occurs. Looking at the list of churches, so I can find from these names, I can find which of the records are on Family Search. And if you go to the Family Search catalog and you looked for the parish of the Heart of Jesus, the Parroquia Corazón de Jesús, then you would be looking, it would probably, that would lead you to those specific records that were in the Family Search collection. You would also know whether you didn't have records from that parish, and you may then have to look to determining what the diocese was. But that's simple enough search that's done online. If I put what is the diocese for the parish of Nuestra Senora de la Merced in Puerto Rico, and then I would be able to, I would be able to use that as a search. And obviously, we had some fast food places set in here with Church's Chicken there. That's probably not going to have records we need. This is what they look like. This is what the list of the Catholic parishes would look like. And so you could actually do a find, command find on your computer and put in the name of the parish and see if it shows up here. It might be, but you have to know one thing. Catholics name their parishes after the same people all the time. So there's always going to be a San Francisco de Assis parish someplace in the country, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So they're not necessarily unique names. So I can go to the catalog and see the parish registers, and I need to know the exact parish. Now, how does this work if I'm doing this in the United States? Same process. You're looking at the parish, you're looking at the voting district, you're looking at the school district, you're looking at the city, you're looking at whatever it is you're looking at the location, and then you're using that to focus on the records that could be made available from that location. Now, interestingly enough, the research wiki for the Family Search research wiki is also organized on geographic areas. So if you want to know what records are available for this particular county or particular state or particular country, You can go directly to the research wiki and get the information and the explanation of how those records work. So that's a good place. So now what happens if we want to find some old places? I mean, really old places, places that perhaps no longer exist, that were once a named place. We have here the board on geographic names, and you can find it by typing in the board on geographic names. It's part of the USGS website, which is very hard to work with, but this is very specific. So they began gathering names in 1890, and they're still gathering and maintaining this huge database. It's free, and actually you could download it if you wanted to. It'd probably use up most of your computer space, but it is a very, very, very detailed map of the geographic name system of every place and its name. And the part of it, when you click on that and look for it, is what you're wanting to go further over on the left-hand side. You click on domestic names. And then here is for the United States, Geographic Names Information System. If you've worked with Family Search and you're seeing all those the standardized names that come up with Family Search, the original place where they came from was this database. Okay, so this is a sample search. I put in the name Pumpkin Hollow. My ancestors say they came from Pumpkin Hollow, and so I go, great. And now if you can see this on the screen, you'll see everything listed, and it goes off the screen. There's probably 50 places in the United States, different places in different states named Pumpkin Hollow. Seems to be very popular. It's like Grandview or Glenview or any other names that we have. There's going to be one in every town, every state, and in the case of Pumpkin Hollow, there's probably one in most of the counties of every state. It's just surprising. But this is the way you get into where each of those, clicking on any one of those names will bring up the geographic location of that place, and meaning the coordinates, the geographic coordinates, so that you can find it specifically on a map. And a different way to do that is to use those coordinates to find it on Google Earth. That's another option here. Those are things that you need to learn about. This is kind of the standardized place in the United States for going to learn about whether the counties existed at the time that your people lived there. This is the Atlas of Historic County Boundaries. I usually just type in Atlas of Historic County Boundaries to find this. And it has become over the years that it's been available. Actually went offline for a couple of years while they revised it, but now it's back and it's working very well. This is an interactive map. You can click on the map on any state and see the entire history of the movement of the counties. Here it lists various ways that all the information that's about every single county in the United States from 1620, 1605 actually, to the present are listed here. And you'll learn, and it will give you every change to every county, where the land came from, which counties they came from, where the counties were, what they located, and why this is important is because somebody would say, for example, that this is a simplistic view because Arizona only has 15 counties. But if you said that your ancestors lived in Apache County, that may be true early on in Arizona, but as time changed, they may have been put into Navajo County. And the same thing happens in all the states. But this is an absolutely essential book. till you get to and work with this program and get familiar with the different counties for giving that location. One of the most common things I find is that if I'm in looking at what people have in their information, is they'll list that they were in that county at a certain date, and I'll go in here and say the county didn't exist. Where were they? And so that's when we get into some questions. So here's an example of the kind of information. This is North Carolina, and shows when the county was created. It also tells the actual citation to the state law creating the change, or the how the legislature passed different actions to, or whoever was making the changes in the counties. This is the interactive map, and as you click on the list of dates on the left-hand side, then the map readjusts itself, and you can zoom in quite a ways on this map and get details down to the cities and see exactly where they were in what county at what time period. One last one is the goal of the national maps. This is the national maps historical topographic mapulation has the digital repository for all of the USGS scale larger maps printed between 1884 and 2006. Okay, so if you've ever done any hiking, camping out in the wilderness and used a topo map, a topographical map, then you're familiar with them. If you were in the Army, you're familiar with them. If you're in the Boy Scouts, you probably were, or Girl Scouts, you're probably familiar with them. But people as range are not familiar with them normally. And it's something you need to learn about, and there's plenty of information here on the website to explain it, but you should do another search on learning about topographical maps. What you can do here is basically pick a location, and then it will show you all the maps available for that location, and you can go through them and use them. In fact, there's a viewer that will allow you to look at the maps on top of each other, so you can kind of move the timeline and see the change of how the map was changing. This is helpful for finding very, very remote and difficult places to find. Using this, we have been able, using the Geographic, the board on geographic names, and using the maps, we have found post offices that were only open for a month in the 1800s. So there's things like that you can do with these maps. And also you can find lost places, because what appeared on a map in 1800 may no longer appear on a map in 2025, or it may be in the middle of some other place and absorbed into a bigger city, or have been abandoned. And this map shows a couple of places that are no longer in existence. So keep learning and keep looking, because it's important that you work through these. And this is kind of a beginning of an exploratory project. So thanks for watching. This is, by the way, obviously what it is a vendor for different, mostly magazines in Segovia, Spain.
Karen asked, do you have a handout? James usually doesn't have handouts, but he can probably send me the link to these slides. Is that okay, James?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, we'll be doing a PDF of the slides. They're available with the recordings of these on the BYU Library Family History Center website. Okay, thanks everybody.
Allison asked, how about transcript?
Well, they're recorded on. We don't really have any way to do that efficiently with all of the videos we're doing. So, from the university, but you're welcome to transcribe it if you want. Simple way to do that is to let it run while you have Dictate open in Microsoft Word or in Google Sheets. Either one of those will put you, or I mean Google Docs. Either one of those can give you a fairly good transcription. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will hopefully be on April 16th. We're dealing with some scheduling conflicts, so we'll be sure to let you know what that webinar will be, or if we have to cancel it, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll keep you updated. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.